Good day and welcome to this episode of Focus On with myself, Fifi Peters. In today's episode, we continue the ongoing discussion around Africa's energy transition. It is a transition, as you know, that will require a multi-pronged approach, just given the size of the task and the scale of investments required. Speaking to the investments, the Standard Bank, Stanlib and Liberty have joined forces to set up the Khanyisa Energy Transition Fund. And to tell us a little bit more about this and the investment prospects the fund potentially offers, I am joined by Asanda Tsotsi. He's the head project and expert finance at Standard Bank CIB, as well as Johan Marnewick, the head of credit alternatives over at Stanlib. Johan, I want to begin with you, just given the fact that Stanlib will be managing this fund. There's a lot of funds of this nature with a similar mandate that have propped up right now, just given the scale of the requirements for the energy transition here on the continent, in the world, in fact. Yes. But tell us a little bit more about Khanyisa and exactly how it will work.
Yeah, absolutely. So the word Khanyisa, obviously, just maybe to begin with, is a Zulu word that talks to the concept of illuminating and kind of switching on the lights and a spark, so a thought idea. So we launched a Khanyisa Impact Fund, which is a broader fund seeking to achieve certain wide spectrum UN Sustainable Development Goal objectives. And under that fund concept of Khanyisa Impact Fund, we've created a sleeve for energy transition, because it is a UN Sustainable Development suite of goals also. So this energy fund, Khanyisa Energy Transition Fund, will sit underneath that, and what we're looking to do is to raise capital into the energy transition theme, both in South Africa as well as Pan-Africa. And wearing the hat of investors, we're able to bring these assets, which are interesting assets for investors. They're not listed assets, they're unlisted by nature, so it's alternative assets. So typically investors look at these as diversifying their potential portfolios that they can invest into. It's not assets that they can find readily on the marketplace. So we as fund managers try to source these assets for our investors, bring them to them, and obviously in time manage them through the sweat of our brows, so to speak.
Sure. No. Thanks so much for that description. But when you talk about interesting assets, if I can just come back to you, what does interesting mean? Practically, what does that look like? And exactly how much are you looking to raise from investors right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So this fund is aiming to be a $1 billion fund ultimately, or the equivalent thereof. We will have the majority of those assets likely sitting in South Africa, but it is a fund that has a Pan-African aspirations in time. So do expect as an investor to see both a rand proposition as well as a dollar proposition adding up to that $1 billion. Why interesting? Well, there's a couple of reasons. In the packaging of the assets, we're looking to introduce a little bit of gearing into this fund. Gearing enhances the return ultimately for investors, so that's why we look to do that, absolutely. Okay. Secondly, it is of interest to investors that we have seed assets in here. That means that there's scale on day one for investors to come into assets that they can point to, so money isn't going to sit around and wait to be invested, especially in infrastructure assets that could take a long time. So your money will be productive on day one. That's a point of interest. And I think then we can broadly speak around the energy transition theme, right? So these assets that fall into this theme are assets, for instance, like renewable energy. We see them all over the country now. We know the country's had a very successful REAP program, but in addition to that, also self-generation type of energy assets. So as the country grapples with its energy shortages that obviously we've been experiencing, but also to become more efficient in the production of energy ultimately, many people in the country are embracing new technologies that are more efficient and allowing people to have that kind of sustainable source of energy. So there are self-generation companies looking for capital the whole time, for instance, to install solar panels or other technology onto buildings all over Johannesburg, all over the country. Other energy transition themes are, for instance, gas as opposed to carbon-heavy coal, so to the etc., etc. Right? These are latest technologies deployed into the production of energy, for consumers all over the country and the continent. You can imagine how important this is for the rest of the continent.
And this is certainly something that you're clearly passionate about. I mean, when you're talking about the interesting aspects of these assets, your face, in a sense, is just lighting up, like the name of this fund. But as Johan did say, this is not a fund that's starting from scratch. Asanda, they are seed assets, so there's already some eggs in the basket, as it were, provided by the Standard Bank Group amongst other partners. So perhaps just to help us better understand the role that Standard Bank is playing here and why it was so important for you to back this.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that question, Fifi. Between Standard Bank and Liberty, we have contributed 3 billion rands worth of seed assets into the fund. These are renewable energy assets, which we have originated in previous rounds of the REAP bid windows. They're high quality assets. I think, as Johan has mentioned, they are operational. They're producing green electrons into the grid as we speak. I think for us, this fund is important for a number of reasons. I think the first is really around, collating sources of funding or different sources of funding into the energy transition. I think where the continent finds itself is, we do need to electrify or provide access to energy to our population. And funds like this, I think, are going to be critical to manage that.
I mean, I think that the social aspect of such a fund is it's non-debatable. It's needed, and the social impact, I think, very much understood in terms of the access to energy and what this means for communities. But we're talking about investments, and investments need to also attract returns. And so perhaps, Asanda, you can just break down a bit some of the return profiles we're looking at here. I mean, your shareholders would want to know where their money is going and ultimately what comes back.
Yeah. So Fifi, I mean, maybe what I can say is that the returns that the fund generates, I think, are reasonable, I guess, from a risk-adjusted perspective. So certainly worth investing in. We are still working on finalizing what the yields will look like. But what we are testing at the moment is does work, I guess, and it does generate reasonable returns for investors.
Okay, so Johan, the Standard Bank on board, the Liberty Group also on board. But who else is a potential investor in this climate, and what are the T's and C's, obviously, of that?
Yeah, so we are showing the fund to a number of our clients from Stanlib. And the type of investors that we're approaching are your institutional type investors. These are pension funds, development finance institutions, and other people who play within the institutional investment space. Why do they like it? So part of what Asanda had mentioned there, yes, attractive returns on a risk-adjusted basis, but also on a standalone basis, so an absolute basis, as they say. These are debt assets, which means that they have steady cash flows, which are coupons effectively, and that yield in the, high single digits, sometimes low teens, on a consistent basis, right?
So akin to investing in a bond, for instance?
100%, absolutely right. Only in this particular case, it enriches the kind of cash flow fixed income offering, right? So there's the listed bond markets. People know what's listed there. They're familiar with it. They might be a bit concentrated because South Africa and certainly the whole African continent, bond markets do tend to be fairly concentrated into typically sovereign or other SOE type of issuers. It's not, Africa and South Africa is not characterized by having very wide and deep bond markets. So an offering like this adds to that diversification and allows people to have sometimes counter-cyclical cash flows when bond markets are behaving and responding to macro factors such as the Fed deciding to raise or lower interest rates. Suddenly here you've got an asset class that frankly doesn't care about that.
Sure.
It's an alternative
For now.
asset class that stands alone and can continue to produce those cash flows, which is why investors do find this kind of thing quite interesting.
Okay. Asanda, I think that we have seen quite a number of players understanding that everyone has a role in financing Africa's energy transition, in ensuring that it happens to the scale and at the pace that is required. But ultimately, as you look at an investment like this, the Standard Bank, and maybe some of the other stuff that you do have on the table, what do you envision the ultimate long-term prospects to be?
As I said earlier, I mean, the energy transition is critical for the continent. I think we, as a group, we see our role, really being a catalyst to raise different funding sources in order to finance these transition assets. Really, it's about mobilizing sustainable finance, which ultimately, at the end of it, will see, I guess, a continent like ours, where we are providing access to electricity to all of our population, where we are mitigating climate risks at the same time, so reducing greenhouse gases. But ultimately, it's really about growing the continent and giving access to electricity to people who currently do not have that access.
Gentlemen, we'll leave it there for now. That is where we are wrapping up today's conversation, of course, looking at the Khanyisa Energy Fund, the latest innovation just coming out of the Standard Bank Group, Liberty and Stanlib, that partnership there. But I was in conversation with Asanda Tsotsi, the head project and export finance at Standard Bank CIB, and Johan Marnewick, head of credit alternatives over at Stanlib. Until next time, thanks once again for tuning into this episode of Focus On, but it's goodbye.